Hei. Hei, og velkommen til Bergen Kunsthall og Landmark og Platform. Jeg skal gjøre den lille introduksjonen min på engelsk, som vanlig. So, welcome to Platform. Platform is the Bergen Kunsthall's lecture series in which we present talks and lectures and discussions, usually on contemporary art and often related to our exhibition program. Tonight, a bit exception to that rule with a music writer today. We are very proud and happy to be able to present this talk by British music writer Simon Reynolds. Simon Reynolds is among the absolutely foremost music writers of the past 20 years or so, with a succession of crucial books on themes like post-punk and club culture, among many other things. And he has been active as a music journalist since the mid-80s, contributing to magazines and newspapers such as Melody Maker, The Guardian, New York Times, Art Forum, Freeze, The Wire, and Slate, and so on. When we first contacted Simon last spring, I think it was, his latest book, this one, Retromania, Pop Culture's Addiction to Its Own Past, had just been released, I think. And during the months that has passed since that time, it's been very interesting to see the great amount of attention that this book has gained. It was considered by many to be the most important work on music to be published last year in a lot of these year roundup summaries. And I think it must already be probably one of the most quoted books in record reviews and texts in magazines all over the place. So Reynolds appears to have really struck a nerve with this book, where he formulates a kind of a diagnosis on current popular culture. In the book, he describes a retrospective tendency that can be found more or less all over the whole spectrum of popular music today, with innumerable reissues of classic rock albums, old greats from the infancy of rock on endless new tours all around the world, and also this kind of institutionalization of rock culture in form of, for example, rock museums and so on. Just to mention a few of the tendencies that he discusses in this book. And tonight, following the main argument maybe in Retromania, Reynolds will take up what he calls recreativity, dealing with the emergence of theoretical positions that encourage themes such as artistic practices based on copying and appropriation and plagiarism. But yeah, I will leave it with that, I think, for my part, and please give a warm welcome to Simon Reynolds.
Good evening. I've never used one of these before, so I feel weird. I think this probably looks like a big spot, doesn't it, from a distance? Hello. Thanks very much to Bergen Kunsthall for bringing me here. It's my first time in Norway. I'm very excited to be here. I wrote, as Steinar said, I wrote this book, Retromania, and the book deals with a whole bunch of kind of related, yet in some ways also quite disparate phenomena that all seem to add up to a kind of unhealthy preoccupation with the past, a sort of increased presence of the past in the present. So everything from the nostalgia industry, which includes revivals, reunion tours, mostly I'm looking at music, but I'm also looking at similar kind of trends in fashion and art. I'm looking at the impact of new media, things like the history of heritage, and musealization, or the huge growth in the number of museums, digital culture, particularly focusing on the impact of the MP3 and file sharing, the iPod, and YouTube as a sort of giant collective archive, and how all those things sort of merge to form a condition that some have called atemporality, where there's a weakened sense of a zeitgeist, more a sense of all the different eras of history, or perhaps not all of them, but a lot of different eras and musical moments and periods all being somehow active again, or accessible again for bands, so that they can access a star from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, or combine elements of all of them. And I'm also looking in the book at the history of revivalism in pop music, and how it's not an overnight condition, Retromania. It's something that has built up, not unlike global warming in a sense, obviously not as important, but it's something that took a while to coalesce, and definitely has a history, a history of an emergence, but it nonetheless seems to be chronic at this point. And writing a book like this, in some ways, is kind of like it's kind of like a probe. I mean, I'm sending out a probe or a test. I'm trying to I'm semi-consciously, I'm kind of wanting to find out if anyone sees things the same way I do. Whether they have the same feeling of sort of anxiety and being kind of perplexed by these developments. And I found, that quite a lot of people do, but actually quite a lot of people don't feel the same way. Some have, I have had a lot of attention for the book, but not all the attention has been, friendly at all. Some of it's been downright hostile, actually, and some have rejected. Quite a lot of people have rejected the premise of the book, and the main premise really. There are many premises in the book, I suppose, but one of the main angles is this idea that innovation in music has slowed down drastically in the last 10 to 12 years, and that this is a cause for alarm, something to worry about. And some have actually denied that this has happened altogether, but most people, even the people who disagree with the book, they say, well, yeah, it's this is true, but then they say, but why does it matter? Well, more or less, why are you so bothered by this, Simon? And that reaction has been fascinating to witness, because it suggests that a surprisingly large number of music fans don't particularly. Innovation isn't like a particularly important criteria for them. It's not particularly a way they measure music. But the most interesting of all the reactions I got to the book, the thing that came up in a lot of reviews that people put out as a sort of, as a counter-argument to my book, was what was the surprisingly widespread belief that artistic innovation is overrated, and that historically it's happened a lot less frequently than is claimed. And then beyond that, a further claim is that recycling and revivalism and derivation are actually integral to music, art, literature. And so to this is the subject of this talk, which is this thing I call recreativity. Because there's been this kind of boom, actually, in recent years of theoretization and argument in really across the board in many different areas of criticism and academia. And the general angle of this sort of theory is that notions like originality and innovation are not just, are not that important, but that they never, that they're myths, that they are, it's a myth, a kind of lie, and instead they propose various sort of artistic strategies that I lump together under this term recreativity, as opposed to creativity. And the thing that really struck me about reading these, not so much the responses that my book got, but that when I've read various sort of debates, books, there are websites and things devoted to this, there's a real kind of excitement in the tone. There's a sense that something is being overthrown. Something is being overthrown that is at once oppressive and yet obsolete. This model of innovation, originality, is both irrelevant yet something that needs to be defeated as well. And then they're replacing it with this sort of this idea everything is and always has been recycled, and that's related to that. And usually this is brought out to celebrate sort of things like remixing, mashups, fan fiction, various other sort of artistic strategies. And there are been some sort of recent kind of flashpoints that in themselves aren't that interesting, but it's more the sort of arguments that they've emerged around these flashpoints. So, for instance, there was a sort of small controversy recently about an exhibition of paintings by Bob Dylan of Asian scenes, and the exhibition catalogue, the blurb in the catalogue, talked about them as a visual journey of Dylan's travels with first-hand depictions of people, street scenes, architecture, and landscapes. However, a number of the exhibition works were revealed to be not first-hand but second-hand. They were repaintings of famous photographs. For instance, a 1948 image of two old Chinese men by Henri Cartier-Bresson. And there was also another sort of similar controversy was about the video for Countdown by Beyonce, which borrows dances from an experimental ballet choreographed by Anne-Theresa de Keersmacher. And not only that, but it copies the costumes, the set, and even the actual shots from the film that was made of that ballet by someone called Terry DeMay. And and there are other borrowings in the video as well. It's not just experimental ballet that is being ripped off. There's homages to Audrey Hepburn in Funny Girl, Monica Vitti in Modesty Blaise, Jennifer Beals in Flashdance, the look of Diana Ross in the Supremes in the 60s. So, the video is a sort of a massive binge, a riot of retro theft. And what was interesting, that goes on all the time in pop video. Pop videos was born at the very beginning, more or less with the onset of postmodernism. So it's always been something that videos have ripped off. I don't know. Is it Repulsion, the movie with the knives in? By what's his name? I'm blanking. Roman Polanski. There are millions of examples of videos ripping off art. But what was interesting to me was actually that in these cases, defenders sprang up to defend these acts of plagiarism. So, Dylan repainting these photographs was by people defending him was situated firstly in the context of Dylan belonging to a sort of blues and folk tradition in which riffs and melodies and lyrics get reworked constantly, but also in terms of the appropriation art movement, people like Richard Prince, who would rephotograph famous art photographs, and also commercial photography, like the Marlboro cigarette commercials. And then in terms of Beyonce, on the national NPR, which is National Public Radio in America, on their website, Alva No defended Beyonce in a piece entitled "What's New is Always Old." And she was discussing the anxieties about plagiarism that have intensified in the digital era of cut and paste and sampling. And she goes on to claim, sampling is nothing new, not in art and not in life. Every time you use a word or phrase, you are, wittingly or not, making a pastiche out of the linguistic gestures of those who came before you. Evolution, whether in biology or in technology and culture, is never anything other than a redeployment of old means in new circumstances. We use the old to make the new, and the new is always old. A similar sentiment is expressed by Matt Black of Coldcut, who's this British group who pioneered in the late 80s what was then called DJ cut-up records, more or less the same as what we now call mashups. And Matt Black is quoted in a book called Creative License, written by Kembrew, MacLeod, and Peter Dicola. And Black says, you could say that humans are just sampling machines. That's how we learn to speak. That's how we learn to paint and make music as well. And I think, Matt Black and Alva No are making very sweeping categorical claims here. I'm quite skeptical about these attempts to, eternalize and naturalize as part of some unchanging human condition or biological reality what is actually very specific, historically specific technologies and the cultural practices that accompany them. But this is what human beings typically do, which is to remake the past in the present image. And an example of that in terms of people who disagree with my book and wanted to argue that recycling has always been the norm in art. They would aim surprisingly high. They wouldn't pick an easy target. They would pick, a great band. And one assertion that came up that several times actually, and it actually really made me laugh, was this claim that the Beatles were derivative and the Beatles were a retro act. And apart from the absurdity of this notion, what I sensed was a sort of was a kind of ressentiment, a kind of impetus to downplay the achievements of the 60s and sort of cut that whole era down to size. But also, more interestingly, really, was that there was almost like a total inability to imagine that there could have been previous eras of music not dominated by recycling. How it is now is how it's always been. And also that if you thought otherwise at the time, which is what everyone in the 60s did. I mean, if you look at the discourse of the 60s, from every level, media to whatever, it's all about new, change. Even people who hated the 60s, like conservative critics, a British conservative critic wrote a book trying to discredit the 60s, but it's called The Neophiliacs, which means, someone who's obsessively in love with the new. But basically, people argue that this was all delusion. This was false consciousness. So all this was really interesting to me. It actually struck me as being kind of symptomatic of the very syndromes that Retromania is analysing and dissecting. In that book, I mentioned Creative License by Kembrew, MacLeod, and Peter Dicola. That it's primarily those guys are scholars of law, and they're primarily, arguing with copyright law. But early on, to sort of, I guess in legal, the legal term would be to establish precedents to defend the kind of sampling they're defending. They point out a lot of examples of plagiarism before the age of sampling. And often it's actually kind of great artists, people you'd probably consider as leading innovative kind of visionaries who have done this, and so like examples like Stravinsky drawing on folk music, or I think Luciano Berio did a whole album that was composed of quotes from earlier examples of classical music. And MacLeod and Dicola quote the hip-hop journalist Harry Allen, who says, most musicians will say that the best musicians copy. I've never heard a completely original musical idea from anyone. Really? Never? I mean, that's a huge claim, and I feel I could reel off like an enormously long list of musicians who do appear to have been very original, and in quite a few cases actually seem to have done things without any precedent at all. But what I find really unsatisfying and problematic about Alan's contention is that it fails to account for how the new actually comes into being throughout human history and human culture, and how it still does, There's almost a kind of, it's a bit like what Alva No said about the Beyonce video. We use the old to make the new, and the new is always old. It's almost like a kind of self-deconstruction within that generalization. It's like the new as a category always collapses back into the old. It can't be grasped or identified. And this, apart from anything, all these claims of the mythicness, the falseness of the idea of innovation and originality, they just seem unverifiable. They're just so sweeping. One example that MacLeod and Nicolas bring up is that Brahms' First Symphony borrows some musical phrases from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And apparently Brahms would get very annoyed when people pointed it out, and he would say, any jackass can see that, or maybe hear that. But I don't, MacLeod and Nicolas don't seem to be arguing that every single one of Brahms' melodic phrases is derived from somebody else. And they don't, nor do they seem to be suggesting that Beethoven himself, derived that musical phrase in the Ninth Symphony from somebody prior to him. So to prove that originality and innovation were myths, you'd have to show that nobody ever came up with anything ever by themselves that was completely or largely new. And I just think, everyday experience really tells you that people come up with new shit constantly. I mean, jokes, wordplay, all kinds of improvised thoughts. The world abounds with, expressions of individual perception and innovation. So the question that this leads me to is, why have people started to disbelieve in these concepts, and why are they kind of so excited by their new disbelief in them? And partly, I suppose, on the one hand, in a funny sort of way, the ideas actually seem on the surface to be quite new and quite fresh. As a stance, saying originality is a myth actually makes you seem kind of original, and kind of different from everybody else. Unlike old-fashioned people like myself who believe in this, the idea of the tradition of the new, as a famous art critic once put it. I mentioned that, when there's been a lot of debates that sort of spin off these things like the Dylan paintings or the Beyonce video, and they sort of spread online in blogs and in comments boxes. And you do start to see certain phrases crop up rather a lot. One of the phrases that comes up all the time is pop will eat itself. I've actually met the guy who actually came up with that phrase, a music journalist in England, and he wishes he'd copyrighted it because he would have made several £million by this point. It's been used so often, including a pop group that call themselves Pop Will Eat Itself. Another one that you see all the time in these discussions is this maxim that is attributed to various different people. It's the talent borrows, genius steals saying. And it's something I've never actually really understood, to be honest. I'd have thought that genius would really involve generating something no one's ever thought of before. And in fact, if you go back to 1759, there's this guy called Edward Young who wrote a book called Conjectures on Original Composition. And he defines genius. He says, of genius, the only proof is the act of doing well what is worthy to be done and what was never done before. Genius is the introduction of a new element into the intellectual universe. Or if that not be allowed, it is the application of powers to objects on which they had not before been exercised. or the employment of them in such a manner as to produce effects hitherto unknown. I suppose, since I'm quoting a guy from 1759, that does show it's an old-fashioned idea of genius, but it still seems to me to be a good one. Another thing you see all the time, this is a very popular thing that people circulate, and you may have seen it yourselves, is this thing that Jim Jarmusch wrote, which is kind of a manifesto, and it goes, well, it's quite long, but the killer bit is this bit. He goes, "Nothing is original. Steal from anywhere that resonates with inspiration or fuels your imagination. Devour old films, new films, music, books, paintings." And it carries on for quite some time in that vein. And I've seen that it gets everywhere. I've seen it on a T-shirt in a Manchester clothes market called Affleck's Palace. And it was right next to a T-shirt with the slogan, "Fashion will eat itself." So there's an awful lot of this kind of thinking around. People seem to find it very, very sort of fresh and energizing. There's a website called Everything is a Remix, and it's done by this guy, Kirby Ferguson. I think he's in the process of he's doing these video essays, video sort of articles, and I think they're going to become a book at some point. But anyway, it's a very popular website. And you read the comments, and people seem really liberated by the revelation that Led Zeppelin, stole some riffs, the odd lyric, in one or two cases a whole song. Or that Star Wars is full of homages and borrowings, from Kurosawa and Joseph Campbell, and pulp movies like Flash Gordon. Or they're really sort of thrilled by the revelation that Kill Bill and Tarantino's movies generally were made by a video store clerk, and so the movies are packed with these kind of geeky references to other movies. These actually strike me as very sort of soft targets and kind of old news, to be honest. But again, I think there's, particularly with someone like Led Zeppelin, there's a sort of kind of the thriller ressentiment, the kind of almost a democratic, a pseudo-democratic sort of impulse to tear down, the great band, the band that everyone has told you is fantastic and major and made masterpieces, and if we can somehow knock them a bit by pointing out that they did, steal Dazed and Confused from a folk singer, then that's great. Although I would argue that's actually all fairly irrelevant, because Led Zeppelin's innovations are all on the level of their sound as a whole. It's actually an old-fashioned idea it's an old-fashioned idea of copyright. Copyright law says that the top-line melody and the words are the only bit that you can copyright as artistic innovation, whereas the whole history of pop music and rock shows that it's the sound, or the rhythm, or Robert Plant's voice, is the thing that should be copyrighted in some way. So edging out of musical and film examples, there have actually been a lot of arguments in favor of recreativity going on in the literary world. There was a book that got a lot of attention in America by the novelist David Shields, called Reality, Hunger, a Manifesto. It's hugely acclaimed. The whole back of it it's one of those books that has no description of what it is. It just has quotes from people praising it to the skies on the back. And basically what it is David Shields, the novelist, is arguing for a new vision of the author as, I quote, a creative editor presenting selections by other artists in a new context and adding notes of his own. And Shields, at some point in the book, Shields claims that I am quite content to go down to posterity as a scissors and paste man, like a cut and paste artist. But that quote is actually from James Joyce, and in fact the whole book, or nearly all the book, is made of quotations without quotation marks. And it was only from pressure from his publisher that he listed citations at the end. He wanted to put it out there with no citations, all this flow of unattributed text. I had to disagree with all the people on the back of his book because I actually found it a very disjointed and unsatisfying read. But that was also because of my hang-ups about attribution. I was constantly wondering, some of it he came up with, some of it he reworded other people's things, maybe 70% of it is derived from other people. So I was constantly like, whenever I came across something that was good, and I was putting my pencil next to it, I was like, did he actually come up with this, or was it, someone else? And maybe that's my hang-up, maybe that's another old-fashioned thing, I don't know, but I like the feeling of well-being you have towards writers or artists to go to the correct recipient, really. Funny thing is that reality hunger is in itself, in its macro idea, is arguably an expanded remake of an earlier piece of writing, the essay The Ecstasy of Influence, by the novelist Jonathan Lethem. And that, again, it's not a book, but it's a whole essay woven entirely out of quotes, either exactly as they are or just slightly altered to improve the flow. And the title itself, The Ecstasy of Influence, is a mashup. It's Baudrillard's The Ecstasy of Communication into Harold Bloom's The Anxiety of Influence. And I don't know if Jonathan Lethem got the idea of what he was doing from, mashup DJs like Girl Talk, but it's very much the essay is very much the equivalent of that. The difference, though, is that weaving together samples, other people's music into a sort of entertainment on a CD or on a gig is all that Girl Talk, Greg Gillis, that's his real name, Girl Talk does. Whereas in his normal practice, Lethem writes novels that, on the face of it, are actually rather original. They're inventive in their language, the characterization, plot, and which is to say, so all the virtues that his essay, The Ecstasy of Influence, seems to be making light of. And in fact, it is actually the reputation that Jonathan Lethem has as an original writer that made Ecstasy of Influence a public gesture. If someone who was completely unknown and hadn't done all this original work presented this essay, however cleverly done, woven out of other things, I don't think anyone would have paid any attention. I mean, and to do that in an academic context would get you an F grade, I think. And it's not to say that he doesn't. It's very well done for what it is as an exercise. He takes, he uses examples like Nabokov, who apparently got the name Lolita, and the very basic plot of Lolita from an earlier story. Shakespeare obviously stole a lot of plot ideas. There are loads of examples. And Lethem uses that to sort of argue this point. He says, the kernel, the soul, let's just go further and say, the substance, the bulk, the actual and valuable material of all human utterances is plagiarism. And of course, the wit is that is actually from Mark Twain. And Lethem actually misses one example right in front of his nose. He quotes André Breton's maxim, beautiful as the chance encounter of a sewing machine and an umbrella on an operating table. But that was borrowed by Breton from Lautréamont's book, Maldoror. And this is the same Lautréamont who in 1870 declared, plagiarism is necessary, progress implies it. Another figure who's very sort of prominent in the literary sort of end of this sort of argument about recreativity is a guy called Kenneth Goldsmith. He's an interesting figure. He's almost like the incarnation of Retromania in human flesh. He's the guy who's behind this thing called Uberweb, which is this amazing collective archive online of experimental film, tech sound, concrete poetry, avant-garde music. Every time I go there, I just almost faint. I feel nauseous at the thought of all this stuff I could and should check out. The whole 20th century's experimental everything, and then I always go off and do something else. It's another time for Stan Brakhage. But and then Goldsmith has also written about his own personal archive fever, which is he wrote about it in the Wire magazine last year, and it's this obsessive downloading he fell into, which is actually kind of similar to, I have a chapter in Retromania, which is also about me becoming addicted to downloading, but whereas mine is full of shame and self-disgust, Goldsmith seems really happy about this state of affairs. He talks quite happily about, I never listen to this stuff. It's all about the thrill of the hunt. And he seems quite sort of happy that he's completely inverted the whole point of being into music, but mainly he is the author of a book called Uncreative Writing: Managing Language in the Digital Age, and he teaches a course in uncreative writing. The name Uncreative Writing is admittedly a great joke because America is full of creative writing courses and workshops, and so you have to give him credit for that. But he actually teaches this at the University of Pennsylvania, and his students are punished for showing any shred of originality and creativity, and instead they are given good grades for plagiarism, identity theft, repurposing papers, patch writing, which is what a lot of students do anyway, which is just weave together, I did this when I studied history, patch writing your paper or thesis or whatever out of other bits, sampling, plundering and stealing. And Goldsmith is a poet, and his own style is, he does list poems, and he's very into sort of writers he know who create sort of experimental poetry by harvesting texts they found on the web, on social media. They take search engines, they put weird instructions into Google, and all kinds of crazy stuff comes up. And that interested me, because I thought that was kind of like a sort of kind of like an exteriorization of inspiration, related to that point I made earlier about how we naturalize and eternalize our current technology. Nowadays, we tend to see the mind as a computer, as an information processor. So, as opposed to old concepts like the soul or whatever. So, why not use the internet as a mega brain, a sort of collective, depersonalized soul out of which poetry of a kind can be generated. But in truth, I mentioned Shields, I mentioned Jonathan Lethem, I mentioned Kenneth Goldsmith. I'm only scratching the surface here, really, in terms of the critical arguments that are going on in favor of recreativity. There's textual poaching, which is used by Henry Jenkins in the context of fan fiction. Marcus Boon wrote a book called In Praise of Copying. We have, in the art world, you have Nicolas Bourriaud's concept of post-production. You have the musician Amanda Brown talking about post-creation music. There's a person called Rick Prelinger who wrote a manifesto called On the Virtues of Pre-Existing Material, whose bullet points include don't presume that new work improves on old, and honor our ancestors by recycling their wisdom. You have Marjorie Perloff, who came up with this concept of the unoriginal genius, who moves information rather than generates it. Adam Sinreich's book Mashed Up, and due out next month is a book by Austin Kleon called Steal Like an Artist. And there's more. There's at least a half a dozen other people generating this stuff. So, although I didn't fully realize it, I wish I'd written about this in Retromania, but this happens to be, I found out, the intellectual climate into which Retromania emerged. And it's something that these arguments are things that people have drawn on to sort of say that the concept of originality and innovation underpinning Retromania is old-fashioned. But at the same time, a lot of this talk about remixing and recycling, it feels rather familiar and something that's been around for quite a while. I mean, I can remember going to London to a record store that sold import singles from America, and it must have been like 1981 or 1982. And I bought a record called The Adventures of Grandmaster Flash on the Wheels of Steel. You know, one of probably the first record outside of the avant-garde, outside of musique concrète, that was made out of other records. I can remember the rock journalist John Savage writing in a magazine called The Face in about 1983 about how we were in the age of plunder. That was the name of his piece. And he had examples of, he had loads of examples of this, but one of them was this singer called Mary Wilson, who was doing kind of 60s style soul with a sort of 60s style look, like a beehive, 20 years before Amy Winehouse and Adele. And you had there was a whole load of sort of records based around sampling and scratching. Malcolm McLaren's Buffalo Gals, The Art of Noise is close to the edit. A little bit later you had the Justified Ancients of Moo Moo. And even in the literary world you had people like Kathy Acker, who did like a rewrite of Don Quixote, and also a kind of writing equivalent of sampling with her book, The Empire of the Senseless, which had chunks of William Gibson and Mark Twain in it. And, obviously, there are many more examples. Burroughs with Cut Up, Duchamp, Warhol, pictures generate, the appropriation art people I mentioned, like Richard Prince and Sherry Levine. I mean, these ideas seem to have been around for a long while, and you could talk of them, all the current people celebrating them and excited about them as being old-fashioned postmodernists. But obviously, something is making these ideas seem like they have like a renewed currency. Something seems to be making them seem relevant in a way they haven't before. And it's probably got something to do with, everything to do really with computers and the internet and, digital culture as kind of naturalizing postmodernism. So it's no longer, an artistic stance. It's just the way you do things. You live by cutting and pasting text and images. And the thing that interests me, that I sort of start to look at it in Retromania, and I've since thought more about because of all these debates, is how the whole nature of artistic inspiration and influence has been changed by the web. Andy Summers, the guitarist in The Police, who kind of, I guess, a mainstream group, still of the sort of post-punk era, but also they had roots in progressive rock as well. So they, that's like two different progressive ideas or innovation-oriented ideas uniting there, the new wave and progressive rock. Andy Summers once said, when we sat down to write a song, our first impulse was to make sure it didn't sound like any other band. Which is not to say they didn't have influences, but the influences for the Police and for their people of their era were to be resisted. They were, authenticity was something that was hard won. You had to sort of almost go to war with your influences. You had to overthrow them, or at least assimilate them and transfigure them, transmute them in some way. You synthesized all the voices you heard, you synthesized into your own voice. I think also, once upon a time, influence was considered a largely involuntary process. You started out as an artist trying to express yourself. You were unavoidably influenced in some way, in much the same way that mothers and fathers might describe one of your friends as a good influence or a bad influence. And generally, I think by and large, with most musicians and artists and writers, there tended to be really only a few sort of primary influences, and the emergence of artistic identity came through a struggle with these primary influences, often just really one major influence, but these are figures who were like towering figures who, and initially, as an artist or a musician or singer, you would produce imitative work. It was almost like the influence, the predecessor was like an obstacle in the way to self-realization, and you were like pushing against this sort of block of matter in your path, and gradually it becomes sort of more yielding, and you can twist it into new shapes, or you just break through to somewhere else. But nowadays, it's much more the case, I think, that artists actually go out and formulate their identity in a much more considered and premeditated way. They go seeking influences, and then they display their influences like a portfolio, like their credentials. And I think this is a big change from how it used to be. I mean, Paul McCartney once said, the hardest thing about being a musician is hiding who influenced you. So in other words, you wanted to seem like you came up with it entirely by yourself. And I can actually remember from my early days as a music journalist, which would be the late 80s, it was quite common for artists to not want to talk about their influences. Not always, but quite often they didn't. It's still a thing of not really wanting to answer those kind of questions, to kind of make out it came from somewhere else, like maybe from beyond in some mystical way. And I wondered if this was a false memory on my part, but then I recently was digging through some old music papers from the 70s, and I came across an interview with the singer-songwriter Joan Armatrading. And she says, I get asked so many times whether I've been influenced by another singer or writer, but the truth is I haven't really been influenced by anyone at all. Sometimes I think I have to make someone up just to satisfy the questions. Of course I have artists I like Van Morrison, but I don't think he influenced me. And I just cannot imagine a current band saying that. People aren't just sort of really upfront about their influences. They're proud of them, and they work them. It's a kind of form of cultural capital. But perhaps that's because it's less common now for artists to have a sort of a primary, specific ancestor, a primary creditor in terms of artistic debt. More and more, it seems, people have lots and lots and lots of influences, and this reflects the sheer sort of superabundance of music available to young musicians now. I think probably to an extent it was always a praiseworthy goal to be well listened and widely listened, but it was much harder to ease, and now it's just completely easy. There's no dedication involved. There's no money. It's just the kind of base level condition of the existence of being a listener now, is that you listen to an insane amount of music because money is not a problem. So here's an example, I think, of this syndrome. I came across this quote in an interview, and it was one of those ones where I was like, wow, this is gold. I have to use this quote. A musician from Montreal, 23 years old, called Grimes, and she talks of her music as post-internet. The music of my childhood was really diverse because I had access to everything. So the music I make is sort of schizophrenic. And the press release for her new album, Visions, says it's inspired by artists ranging from Enya and TLC to Aphex Twin, drawing from genres like New Jack Swing, IDM, New Age, K-pop, industrial, and glitch. And the press release continues, this approach has marked Grimes as a curator of culture and allowed the project to remain flexible and evolving. And Grimes, I should say I actually like her music quite a bit, but the Grimes version is more frank and blunt. She says, basically I'm really impressionable and I have no sense of consistency in anything I do. However, although that would seem by the old set of values to be, a self-deprecating remark. I think you can almost sense a kind of weird way in which impressionable and inconsistent are becoming valorized, or at least they're sort of, they're close to words like flexible and evolving. I think Grimes's artistic subjectivity corresponds to what the anthropologist Grant McCracken calls a cloud self. He's been exploring this in a book called Plenitude 2.0. And on his blog, he asked, what is it like being you right now? Feeling a little cloudy? Of course you are. Because I mean to be fair, and let's be honest, you are a cloud. He continues, you are an aggregation of interests, connections, and contacts, tagged in several ways, linked in all directions, changing in real time. And I think, in the modern era, this sort of idea of being at least a little bit cloudy around your edges, if not a complete cloud, then, cloudy on the edges of your being is generally being considered a virtue, especially for an artistic person. Generally open-mindedness is considered to be the hallmark of being youth, and people, as they get older, tend to become more rigid. They develop a kind of stiffness or almost an arthritis of the mind. But nowadays, I think everybody, young and old, is just vastly more cloudy than before through their day-to-day contact with the data cloud. So I think, connecting that to creativity versus recreativity, you could see a sort of shift from influences to influx, just a complete flood of ideas and sounds and stimuli. And that's come about because in analog culture, culture came in these sort of bundles that were enclosed, a record, a magazine, a book, or whatever, usually in solid form. And with things like magazines, they were sort of punctual, there were intervals between them coming out. And now, in digital culture, it's more about this sort of constant flow. The culture is completely dematerialized, it's compressible, you can access it at any time, there's no sort of punctuality, and it's also capable of being fragmented into tiny excerpts and blurbs. And so this is kind of like a cataclysmic jolt to what you could call the hydraulics of culture. And as a result, the emblematic words of our era are things like torrents and surfing. These words that are like oceanic words, but they're no longer. Oceanic imagery always used to be kind of utopian, but now these are sort of like threatening and disturbing concepts of floods and going under. I think in the old model of artistic inspiration, as outlined by Harold Bloom in his book Anxiety of Influence, more often than not you would have a kind of a sort of primal encounter with the predecessor, almost like an involuntary visitation. And everything changes from that point on. Like John Lennon hearing, rock and roll, hearing Buddy Holly. A seed is planted, it germinates, and but then you get this sort of Oedipal struggle, the kind of fight with the predecessor, the ancestor, and there's a kind of killing, a patricide, a kind of killing of the father that is also a kind of self-birthing. This is Harold Bloom's sort of model, which is Freudian, obviously, that's also kind of mystical. And that is in the era of, connectivity and data panic. This model is superseded by something that's post-Oedipal and schizoid. The self as a pure screen, a switching center for all the networks of influence. That's me sampling Jean Baudrillard, The Ecstasy of Communication, which was written in the early 80s, but is very predictive of digital culture. And I think, so the whole idea of artistic identity is changing. And Baudelaire talked of the contemporary artist in his day as someone who was sort of drifting through a city, doing the situationist dérive, and who's bombarded with stimuli. And Baudelaire said that the artist could be a kaleidoscope endowed with consciousness. So if you think of the internet as like, the modern mega city, the giga city or whatever, you could update that image and see the modern artist as a kind of search engine endowed with consciousness. I was talking about Grimes, and actually she does have a primary inspiration, but not of sound so much as method. It's this guy, Noah Lennox of Animal Collective, who records solo as Panda Bear. And when Grimes heard Noah Lennox's 2007 album Person Pitch, she realized that it was, although it didn't sound obviously like electronic music, it was all made through loops and samples. And that was something that she could do herself using, I think, GarageBand or one of those sort of programs. And one thing that interested me about Person Pitch, it always struck me when and that record I loved, but I was really struck by, there's this page in the CD booklet where Noah Lennox does this kind of cloud cluster of all his influences in sort of capitalized type. And apart from just the fact that he'd do that so openly, was this the sort of spirit they were done in, which was very, very sort of bizarrely wide-ranging, and included like things that were obvious from listening to his music, like the Beach Boys, more obscure stuff like Fela Kuti, but he also had a lot of things that were just very, very sort of mainstream, well-known, and sort of unhip, like Duran Duran. And I felt that what was interesting was that, to me, contrasted with the other famous example of a group putting a list of influences on their album, which is this sort of industrial group, Nurse with Wound. On their first album, they did this thing that's, which came out in 1979. They did this thing that is still, talked about and quite famous in certain circles. The Nurse with Wound list is what people call it, which is this just list of incredibly obscure groups. Some relatively less obscure now, but at the time in 1979, virtually none of them most people would have heard of. And people actually have blogs that are dedicated to uploading all the albums on this list. And there's a real difference there. The Nurse with Wound list is a testament to kind of hard work and the expenditure of quite a lot of money. It's an idea of taste as a kind of quest for the unknown, the extreme. It's also an implicit challenge, like a throwdown to the listener. It says, find this stuff if you can, listen to it if you dare. The Panda Bear list on Person Pitch is so much more 2000, 21st century digital culture in its spirit. It's like open-hearted, there's nothing snobbish or exclusionary about it. It's like a sharing with the fans. And so I think it really, captures the spirit of file sharing and Spotify and shuffle. It's not listening as a quest. It's a sort of listening as a sort of drift and a kind of overload and overflow. You're not. The goal is not to make an artistic self, which I think is what Nurse with Wound did. Eventually, all those things coalesced into this very narrow and fixated musical path. Nurse with Wound have followed over probably 100 albums since. They're still going. This is an idea of the artistic self as a perpetual kind of unmaking of the self. I mentioned this work, in the talking about Grimes and her album Visions, how she describes herself as a curator, or her label describes her as a curator of culture. And I have a whole chapter in Retromania on the rise of the word curator in music culture. And I think it's particularly interesting in terms of the recreativity discourse, because a lot of the arguments